Can you hear me at the back? We're going to be talking about two things. Macroecology, which is sort of an extension of biogeography. We're also going to be talking about bird conservation. So we'll start off with the macroecology. Macroecology is the study of the relationships between species and their environment at very large spatial scales. So continental spatial scales, global spatial scales. So that's why it's called macroecology. Studying these processes at a very, very large spatial scale. And what macroecology deals with is to try and find explanations for the patterns of abundance and distribution of species across the globe. Right? So that's the field of macroecology. And there are certain patterns that repeat themselves across the globe. You see these patterns wherever you go. On all continents, in all regions, you will see certain patterns. One of the earliest known and described patterns in 1921, in fact, by Arrhenius is the species-area relationship, which is you've got area on the x-axis here, and you've got the number of species on the y-axis. As area increases, the number of species also increases. So the larger the area of a region, the more species you add until you get to the entire globe, and there are no more species to be added. So, for example, one of the things we'll be talking about later is the theory of island biogeography, which looks at islands of various sizes. And if you look at large islands tend to have a lot more species than smaller islands. Right? So the species-area relationship is one of the most commonly seen patterns in at these large spatial scales. The other one is what's called the latitudinal diversity gradient. This is a map of bird species richness. The darker the color, the greater the number of species. And you can see in general, the tropics are extremely species rich, a large number of species in the tropics. As you go towards the poles, the number of species reduces. And that's a pattern you see in all continents. That's a pattern you see with all taxonomic groups. You see that with plants, you see that with mammals, you see that with birds, reptiles, and so on. The tropics are exceptionally species rich. And as you go towards the colder areas, towards the poles, the number of species declines. Why?
Less fluctuations.
Less fluctuations, so more stable climates. All right.
More rainfall.
More rainfall, and therefore
more sunlight on equator. So more sunlight on equator, so produce
more sunlight on equator, so therefore more energy reaching the tropical regions, leading to
More
productivity. Anything else?
They have a greater evolutionary period because the temperate regions had ice, like they were covered with ice, whereas these regions were not.
So historical reasons, right? In the interglacial periods, the tropics were ice-free, whereas the higher latitudes, by higher latitudes I mean towards the poles in the northern and the southern hemispheres. So the equator is 0 latitude. As you go further north or further south, the value of the latitude becomes higher. So when I say higher latitudes, I mean north and south. Right, so the equator was, the tropics still had suitable habitat. They were refugia during glacial periods. Anything else?
Diversity in the habitat. Diversity in the habitat. We have more different kinds of habitat compared to. We have more different kinds of habitats. Diversity in the habitat.
Diversity of habitat, so more niches available in the tropics. So actually this has been a subject of lively debate. Why are there more species in the tropics for more than 100 years? And there are about 140 hypotheses that people have put forward to explain this pattern of greater species, which is a massive number of hypotheses. So older communities, they say that the tropics are much older, partly because they're stable habitats during glacial periods. They were refugia, so they've been stable for a longer period of time. And so older communities have more time for speciation to happen, and therefore there are more species. Some people say there are more niches in the tropics, and therefore every niche can have a separate species occupying it, and you have much more species. People say that there's higher competition in the tropics. And greater competition leads to smaller niches, more specialization, and so you have a lot of very specialized species in the tropics compared to the higher latitudes. They also say that the opposite, there's less competition in the tropics because of higher predation and lower prey population. So you've got hypotheses that completely contradict each other. Climatic stability, the tropics are much more stable climatically than the higher latitudes. That means that rarity is not a problem. If you're a rare species, you can get wiped out by a single climatic event. So let's say you live in a small geographic region and a hurricane hits your habitat, like it has done with the Bahamian nuthatch, which has gone extinct because of a cyclone. That's a problem if you're rare. But if your climate is stable and you don't face these environmental, drastic calamitous events, then rarity is not a problem. So you can have a lot more rare species in the tropics than you can have rare species at higher latitudes where extreme weather is a problem. Productivity, greater productivity leads to greater diversity. That's solar radiation. Somebody said that more solar radiation coming in, plants grow a lot more and are able to therefore support more species. And then there are null models, which we'll get to when we talk about altitudinal diversity gradients. All right. So which of these is it? If you look at a map of global net primary productivity, which is plant growth, basically, right? And you see, like you said, that in the tropics, primary productivity is very high, but there are also parts of the world where primary productivity is high, like the taiga and the forests of. But yes, it's true. Tropical places have high net primary productivity, and where you see high net primary productivity is also the place where you see high bird species richness. So if you compare these two maps, you overlay those two maps, there's a pretty good correlation between global net primary productivity and species diversity, not just of birds, but for a whole lot of other taxonomic groups. But why?
Does this include agriculture?
No. But why should this happen? Why is it that in the tropics you have high primary productivity, but instead of having, let's say, 20 birds, which are very rare, you have one bird that is very common and dominates the entire system. It takes advantage of all the available beach space. We don't have an answer to that yet. So that's another thing to think about when you're planning your research in the future, if you're interested in subjects like this. If you look at the relationship between productivity and diversity, the x-axis is productivity, forget about the units, not important. And the y-axis is the richness, species richness, at very local scales. If you go to a plot, multiple plots, and you measure productivity and diversity, what you get is a hump-shaped relationship. So you get some relationship like that, where diversity peaks at intermediate points. But if you zoom out to a different scale, and you look at really large scales, regional scales, then there definitely is a correlation between productivity and animal species richness. So higher productivity does lead to higher diversity. Here's an example on African fruit eaters, fruit-eating birds in Africa. What you've got is the diversity of ficus, which is figs. Right? So this is a map of the diversity of ficus. The greater the diversity, the redder the color. The fewer the species, the bluer the color. So if you look at that, the Congo Basin and the tropical forests of Western Africa have the highest diversity of ficus. That's where you also get the highest diversity of frugivores. So even birds that can only eat fruit, very close correlation between the diversity of ficus and the diversity of obligate frugivores, birds that only eat fruit. Even partial frugivores are found where ficus densities are high. But when you look at all bird species, that correlation does not happen anymore. So all bird species, the hotspot for concentration is the Eastern Arc Mountains of Africa. The hotspot for the frugivores is the Congo Basin and Western Africa. So frugivore species richness seems to be very, very closely tied with what they eat. So if there's higher diversity in resources, it seems to lead to higher diversity in the organisms exploiting those resources. Again, we get to ice ages, glacial cycles, and refugia. The reason for that is, what are the places that are most productive? Those are places that have the highest incoming solar radiation. Right? This the places that have the greatest amount of sunlight coming to these areas. They have the most amount of energy. And during glacial cycles, what do you think those refugia will be? Also places that have the greatest solar energy coming in. So those places that are really, really warm because of high sunlight are also places that are ice-free. So your refugia are very highly correlated with how much energy the Earth receives. I'll give you two examples of refugia. One is the southeastern United States, which was a refugium during the last glacial cycle. And this is a map of amphibian richness, amphibian species richness, and these are contours. Sorry, you can't see the numbers very well, but as you go away, so there's 90 species there, and as you move away, the number of species keeps reducing. Same thing you see with Northeast India. That was a refugium during the last ice age. The maximum number of species are in that refugium, and as you move away, the number of species declines. So very often you see this pattern where historical refugia during ice ages have had the most number of species, and as you move away from the refugium, the number of species reduces, and that might be the result of different species colonizing habitats at different distances. So you have a lot of species close to the refugium. As you move further away and the environment changes, different species are able to colonize at different distances. So all these things are correlated, right? Net primary productivity of plants is highly correlated with the probability that that area was a refugium or not. The higher the productivity, the greater the chances that you will refugium during the ice age. So is it current? Is it actually right now productivity is determining species richness, or is it historical? That high productivity areas were refugia, and when the ice retreated, now you're seeing colonization to different degrees, and so it's a historical process that's leading to these species richness patterns, rather than anything happening now in ecological time, where the higher the productivity, it can support a greater number of species. So it's still not clear in terms of what it is that leads to these global and regional species richness patterns. Is it largely driven by historical glaciation and interglacial processes, or is it driven by interactions in ecological time right now? So the latitudinal diversity gradient is something that is still a matter of massive debate. We have still not understood fully. We know that there are correlations between various things, productivity and species richness and so on, but we do not know what causes these correlations. I will talk now about, apart from the latitudinal diversity gradient, the altitudinal diversity gradient. So the altitudinal or the elevational diversity gradient. So this is gradients in species richness across mountain slopes. Very often what you see with birds and so on is you don't see the highest number of species. So number of species on the y-axis, elevation on the x-axis, so that's low elevation, that's the plains, the sea level, and you're going up to about 6,000 meters above sea level. And very often you see this mid-elevation peak in species richness. You don't see the highest number of species lower down. You see that somewhere in the middle, the number of species peaks. And a lot of people have thought about this, asking, why does it peak at low elevations? And somebody called Carsten Rabeck, who works in Denmark, came up with what's called the mid-domain effect. Now, the mid-domain effect was a very, very influential concept in macroecology. Right. This is elevation. All right. So low elevation, high elevation, and range size over here. So these are species that have large range sizes. Yeah. So it goes from low elevation all the way up to high elevation. These are species that have very small range sizes, restricted to certain parts of the elevation range. Is that clear? Yeah? What the triangle is showing is the limit to the elevation range, limit to the midpoint of your elevation range. If you have a very large elevation range, the midpoint of your elevation range cannot be here. It cannot be here. If you cover the entire elevation range, then your midpoint has to be in the center of that elevation range, right? It cannot be outside this triangle. Is that making sense? Yes. But for the smaller ranges, your midpoint could be anywhere. Midpoint of your elevation range could be anywhere. So these two lines are just showing the limit to where the midpoint of your elevation range can be, given the size of your elevation range. Yeah? Okay.
Why are we talking about this?
Because this guy comes up with a theory saying, let's say all these species ranges you took on a mountain and you just threw them on randomly. So you have some species that have very large ranges, some species that have very small ranges. Take them, forget about the abiotic environment, forget about adaptation to temperature, forget about adaptation to rainfall, all that doesn't matter. Take all these ranges of different sizes and just throw them randomly on the mountain. What's going to happen? Where do you think the most number of species will end up? In the middle of the elevation range, right? So the maximum overlap between ranges will occur in the middle. So if you have a mountain and you just randomly throw elevational ranges here, a very large elevation range. Take a cross section. Three species here. Take a cross section lower down. Three species here. Take a cross section here. 6 species. So this guy says all of this is not important. Your temperature, competition, and all that is not important. The pattern that you see of the mid-elevation hump in species richness can be created entirely by a random process. So he says, Rabeck says, the mid-elevation hump is very likely the product of an entirely random process. But in 2009, Christy McCain did a study where she looked at these elevational gradient, elevational patterns from across the world, and what she found were 4 types of patterns. There's species richness highest at low elevation and decreases with elevation. The species rich patterns that plateaus at the lower elevations and then declines. Then there's a plateau at mid-elevation and decline, and then the classic mid-elevation hump that people were talking about. Yeah, so she found that there are 4 broad patterns in elevation ranges, in species richness with elevation. And when she put it all together, she did not find, she found, for example, in South America, the declining pattern was the most common, or the lower elevation plateau was the most common. So it turns out that this mid-elevation hump that people found first and thought that this is what happens on all mountains is not true. You see various kinds of patterns of way in which species richness changes with elevation, and once again, like the latitudinal diversity gradient, we still do not fully understand the causes for these different species richness patterns with elevation. So in summary, with biogeography, community ecology, and so on, say historical factors, past climate, speciation extinction, continental drift, the movement of plates, plates colliding, plates moving, in conjunction with current interactions, things like competition, predation, as well as environmental gradients, abiotic factors, changes in rainfall, changes in temperature, changes in seasonality. All these interact, all these come together to ultimately structure bird communities and lead these communities, when they're structured this way, this then leads to broader patterns at large spatial scales, not like the latitudinal diversity gradient or the altitudinal diversity gradient. So we have, as of now, we have some understanding of these current interactions and how they influence communities. And again, mixed blocks are a very beautiful way in which model system in which you study these interactions. We have some idea of how environmental gradients like temperature, rainfall influence species niches. What we do not understand yet very well, although we have some idea of historical factors in refugia and so on. How do these 3 things interact? What is the relative importance of historical factors versus current interactions like predation and frugivority and so on, and the influence of the abiotic environment in structuring bird communities and leading to these large spatial patterns. So the field of macroecology, which was born in the early to mid 90s, is still very much ripe for research. There's a lot of research that can be done in the field of macroecology, and it's also relatively easy to, the concepts are many, but the work itself is relatively easy to do because you have now global maps of temperature, of rainfall, of seasonality, of vegetation, and so on, which are all remotely sensed from satellites. And you have these fine-scale maps of the entire world, and you also have maps of species richness, you also have maps of all these things. So putting those together, one can generate new insights about in the field of macroecology. So I'll stop here in terms of community ecology, biogeography, and macroecology, but I'll take any questions if anybody has.